Okay, historians, we are going to be kind of entering our last unit, which is a really short unit, which will basically just be kind of today and tomorrow and maybe a little bit on Friday. As we talk about the end of the Cold War and then also a little bit of the rise of terrorism. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about the rise of terrorism and things that led up to 9/11. Now, just to start off with here, the moon landing, when you talk about who wins the space race, really the United States wins the last major victory. We get to the moon before the Russians do. We we walk on the moon, or I should say the astronauts do. I never walked on the moon, but Americans walk on the moon. I believe it was 13 total Americans in a few different missions, maybe 4 or 5 different missions, walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong is the first man. Buzz Aldrin is the second. So this is a major victory. After this, what you start seeing as time goes on is the United States and Soviet Union maybe working together a little bit, and other countries working together. We end up in the 90s and the early 2000s with the International Space Station. If you're in northern Minnesota, oftentimes you can see the International Space Station float by, that type of thing. Um, but this is a pretty big win, and the Soviet Union had spent a lot of money. So had the United States on trying to get to the moon. Here's the crew of Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, and then you have Michael Collins. He was the guy that had to run the spaceship or kind of have to run the shuttle above them. And so then they could connect. They kind of launch this thing back up in the air and it has to connect. So we see that with the space race kind of ending, and then you have that kind of the detente that we talked about during Vietnam, where the United States and Soviet Union start to negotiate and talk more. SALT one and SALT two are strategic arms limitation talks. And there were two big throughout the 70s. There were big ones with there was negotiations and then actual leaders signing documents that said they were going to limit and start to end production of long-range missiles that could carry nuclear warheads. They're going to stop making these weapons of mass destruction and not have as many. Here you can see in 1972, President Richard Nixon with the leader of the Soviet Union signing off. You can kind of see the nuclear arms limits here. Um, these long range missiles, how many different, the number that we're going to, cut it down to. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, what we're going to cut it down to. The nuclear warheads, nuclear subs, that type of stuff. And here's 79. Here's President Jimmy Carter. Also in 1979, in Iran, they have a revolution. It's pretty much a bloodless revolution. There's not a lot of fighting. The military kind of just backs down. The people are protesting, and they end up getting rid of the Shah that you see right here. And he was a dictator that the United States had helped put in charge or keep in charge back in the 1950s. He was a guy that we supported. He did things we wanted. He was very much against the Soviet Union, and we liked that. The problem was he wasn't a very good leader. He didn't allow for much freedom for free speech. People were put in jail. There might have been people assassinated. And he was a person the United States usually doesn't like, except he was against the Soviet Union. So we like that. Well, they get rid of him, and the dictatorship was gotten rid of, and they replace that leader, the Shah, with the Ayatollah Khomeini, that you see here. And the problem ended up being that he was even worse than the Shah in many regards. And he was anti American, anti West. He did not like the Western world. And they go from having a lot of Western, music and Western clothing to that's all locked down. Women are going to have less rights. and they've become a religious theocracy where religious leaders are in charge of the country ever since then. So, in some regards, in a lot of regards, things got worse after he took over. But that's why Iran has really been kind of anti-United States. We're also friends with Israel that they don't like. Now, at the same time, the U.S. Embassy was stormed, and our workers there, our embassy workers and ambassadors, were taken hostage, over 60 of them, for over a year, over 444 days, they're taken hostage. So that's known as the Iranian hostage crisis. They did make a little movie about it called Argo, and this was a CIA plan where they snuck in a CIA agent who was posing as a filmmaker, and I think it was five embassy workers had escaped and gotten over to the Canadian embassy. And so the CIA agent gets there and pretends to be a filmmaker, and he sneaks those five embassy workers out. They were pretending to be Canadian filmmakers. The movie they were pretending to make was Argo. So if you wanted to see a movie about this time period and this event, Argo is a pretty good movie. Ben Affleck's in it. Here are the hostages returning home. And then in that same year, 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. There had been a civil war in Afghanistan going on, and there was a communist government, and um, the Afghani rebels were trying to overthrow this communist government. The Soviet Union does not want to see that happen, so they send in soldiers and tanks to help the Afghani communists fight against the anti-communist Muslim Afghanis. And so what ends up happening here is the United States sees this as a possible um, payback for Vietnam. In Vietnam, the Soviet Union and China had aided the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh in North Vietnam. Here, now the United States is going to secretly help the Afghani rebels fight against the Soviet Union. The other group that comes in, besides the CIA helping wage this secret war, is a group called the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen are Muslim freedom fighters, and you had Muslim freedom fighters, Islamic freedom fighters coming from other parts of the world to help these Muslim Afghanis fight against the Soviet Union. And so they come. And one of the more famous, he wasn't famous at the time, but he becomes famous later, or maybe infamous leaders, is Osama bin Laden, who also fought. So at this time, he was fighting against the Soviet Union. So were we, not directly, but indirectly. Here'd be a picture of some Mujahideen or Afghani rebel fighters. Now, where were they getting some of these good weapons from that could take out a tank, take out a helicopter? The United States is providing them. Here's an old picture of Osama bin Laden, and these are Mujahideen. These guys are not Afghanis. They're coming from somewhere else. And you've got Osama bin Laden. Looks like a leader from Algeria and a leader from Syria in the background, and they were in Afghanistan fighting. I think this is something that takes down a helicopter, some anti-aircraft. Those are expensive bullets. There's a Russian soldier with his AK-47 on the streets of Kabul. They did make a movie about the CIA operation, how we had to secretly get these weapons into the Afghani hands, into the rebel hands. The CIA to this day says we never gave weapons to the Mujahideen coming from other countries. We never gave weapons to an Osama bin Laden. On the flip side, though, could the Afghani rebels have given some of those weapons to the Mujahideen? Possibly. Pretty good movie, though, called Charlie Wilson's War. Charlie Wilson was a senator or a congressman. I think congressman, not senator. Could be wrong. From Texas. And he was one of the guys that kind of got this thing going, worked with the CIA, got money from Congress to fight against the Soviet Union. Here's a photograph of Charlie Wilson in the 1980s when he took a trip to Afghanistan. Now, during the 80s, this was 10 years that the Russians fought in Afghanistan, and it took a lot of money to do that. During this same time, a man is elected, or not elected, is chosen by the government as the leader of the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he started to make some small changes that were very different from things you would have seen from guys like Khrushchev or guys like Stalin in the past. And he called these changes glasnost and perestroika. And glasnost was an idea of openness, and it was going to be um, not freedom of speech, but it's going to be I am going to tell you why these decisions are being made. So glasnost meant openness, and perestroika was reforms to aid the economy, and it was to institute some free market reforms, capitalism into this communist economy. A few years after perestroika starts, McDonald's is allowed to come there and build, and look at the lines of people to get McDonald's in, I think this is Moscow. I mean, huge lines, and they were paying a lot, like $20 for a hamburger at the time. But capitalism was new, and McDonald's was one of the first Western companies to get in Russia or the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time, some Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary start to dissolve their Soviet governments, and the Soviet Union isn't, or I should say Soviet governments, start to dissolve their communist governments, and the Soviet Union isn't stopping them like in the past. If you remember back in the 50s, Hungary wanted to get rid of their communist government. Soviet Union went in with tanks to make sure the Hungarians stayed communist. They wanted to keep up the Iron Curtain. Now these countries are being allowed to become independent, or they don't have to listen to the Soviet Union anymore, and they're going to be allowed to become democracies. And we start to see slowly but surely a lot of these countries start to become democracies. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. The Soviet support that was coming in for the East Germans disappears. The East German soldiers aren't told to stop it. The wall comes down. East Germans can openly walk over to West Germany. I was a little kid. I didn't understand what was going on, but I do remember the news. I remember people dancing on the wall. I remember people saying it was a big deal. For years and years, when we would have show and tell in school, kids would bring in little chunks of cement and they would show them to everybody and be like, "Oh yeah, my mom came back from Germany and she brought a piece of the Berlin Wall." I mean, that was, and then they'd pass it around, and all the little kids would look at this little chunk of cement, be like, "Oh yeah, the Berlin Wall." So a year later, West Germany and East Germany are put back together and become Germany. So now, today, you kids were born and they're in a world that only had one Germany. And maybe some of your parents were even born into a world that only had one Germany. Boris Yeltsin in the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union starts to fall in 1990, they decide to have democratic elections, and Boris Yeltsin is the first democratically elected president of Russia. The Cold War is basically over. The other countries start to break up and become independent. The Soviet Union breaks up into 14 different countries. Russia obviously is the largest. You can kind of see the map. I think I had it over here. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, these were all part of the Soviet Union, one big country, and now they're going to be their own independent countries. And there's more countries over there like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Georgia and Armenia and stuff over here that all get to become their own independent country. So things are really changing. Now, Afghanistan, the Soviet Union left in 1989. Just because the Soviet Union left and kind of was broke after 10 years of fighting there, doesn't mean that the Civil War is over with. It's not. There's like 5 or 6 different groups kind of fighting this Civil War. Unfortunately, one of the craziest groups of all, called the Taliban, is able to kind of win the Civil War there and start to take over. And the Taliban were full of Islamic extremists, and they took a lot of rights away from women. Women and girls couldn't attend college or school. They didn't allow any Western influence in there, like blue jeans. If you go back into the 70s in Afghanistan or 60s, things were progressing. The Western culture was kind of going in there. Women could attend school. Once the Taliban takes over in the 90s, no more of that. The Taliban also starts to make money off of opium, farmers growing poppies. This would be sold to produce heroin around the world. And you can look at the map here. You can see in 1992, while the Civil War is going on, different groups controlling different parts of Afghanistan. By 1996, the Taliban in the light green has taken over most of Afghanistan. And by 2001, when 9/11 occurs, the Taliban controlled almost all of it, except for the Northern Alliance in the north. Now, once we invade Afghanistan, we will become allies with the Northern Alliance. Now, Osama bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia, and he had gone to Afghanistan and fought there against the Soviet Union. Well, after the war is over with, he kind of gets kicked out of Saudi Arabia for some of his extremist beliefs, and he's allowed by the Taliban to go and operate and set up a base of operations in Afghanistan. And this is where the terrorist group Al Qaeda really begins to grow. Tomorrow, we'll talk about a series of events in the Middle East with Osama bin Laden and others that is going to allow or going to lead up to 9/11 to occur, and we'll talk a little bit about 9/11. And so that's what I have for you today. You can fill in that note sheet, and I'll have a couple of links below for you to view as well. See ya.